of the Finance and Audit Committee for the Sacramento Metropolitan Fire District to order at this time. Board Clerk, can you please call the roll?
For the consent agenda, do I have a motion?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I move that we approve consent items 1 and 2.
Excellent. There's a motion to accept the consent items. Consent agenda. Any questions from other board members? Seeing none, I will second the motion. We've got a motion second. Would you please call the roll?
Director Jones?
Aye.
And Director Kelly?
Aye.
Motion passes.
All right then. Presentation items. Ms. Thomas?
Good evening, directors, Chief Wells, Amanda Thomas, Chief Financial Officer for the district. I'm here this evening to present the financial report for the first 10 months of the fiscal year. So that's the period ending April 30th, 2016. The first chart that we typically look at is the district's cash balance, and I'll just remind you that what we're looking at here is the cash balance in all of the funds that the district holds, not just our general fund, but all of our funds. And you can see down on the legend there that we're showing monthly amounts for fiscal years 14, 15, and then the current fiscal year 2016. So we've our most recent data that we're showing here is through April 30th of 2016. You will see, looking at that red line, which is our current fiscal year, for that April data point, we're below where we were the 2 previous fiscal years, and that really just has to do with the timing of the second installment of property taxes and when that's reflected in the cash balance. So although we have earned those property taxes as of the end of April, and you'll see them reflected in the revenue numbers I'm discussing, they weren't actually reflected in the cash balance April 30th. So you'll see that in the cash balance in the next report, and in prior years they were shown earlier. So that's the reason for the difference between this year and prior years. But as of the end of April, our cash balance was approximately $4 million. Turning to look at our general fund reserves. So here we really are just looking at the general fund, and we're not looking at a cash number, but we're looking at those reserves that are held in the general fund. And the way that we calculate that is we look at our starting reserve balance, and we're going to add in all of the revenues that have been received year to date through April and subtract out all of the expenses year to date through April to get to what our current general fund reserve number is. And again, here we have data for the current fiscal year as well as the 2 previous fiscal years. Current fiscal year shown in red. So you can see that we're generally tracking with where we've been at this point in the year and previous fiscal years. So we've gotten that second installment of property tax revenues that's kind of pushed the line back up. And you'll see that we would expect it to trend downward in the remaining 2 months of the year as our expenses will outpace our revenues for those 2 months. You can see that based on our budget, and we're showing down here in the table below, based on our budgeted expenditures, we do expect to end the year with a reserve of approximately $20.5 million, which represents 11.6% of net budgeted expenditures. Taking a closer look at some of our revenues, this chart shows our medic cost recovery revenues. And you can see that our actual revenues for the first 10 months of the year of about $27.5 million are trending slightly below the budgeted line. So the red line is showing you actual, the blue line is showing you the budget for this year, and then green line is showing you actual for last year. We are expecting a budgeted number of $33.8 million to end the year at 33.8, and as I said, through April we're trending slightly below that number, but pretty close to on target with our budget. This chart looks at total revenues. So the same in terms of the coloring of the lines. The red line is giving you this current year, actual year-to-date. We have a blue line for the budget and a green line for the prior year. Again, through the first 10 months of this year, actual revenues, $169 million, trending slightly below budget, but pretty close. One of the reasons that we are below budget is we had a timing on one of our IGTs, where at mid-year budget, we expected that it was a preliminary IGT for Blue Cross. We expected that to occur this current fiscal year. It's actually now going to be occurring next fiscal year and is reflected in next year's budget. That will be a difference for us in terms of our actual results versus our budget. So that's one of the things that's contributing to us being a bit below budget on this chart. The budgeted number is $184 million, which would be the number for the entire fiscal year.
And may I ask, so you figure the IGT is approximately how much?
So the IGT, the net revenue from that particular IGT was about $800,000 in net revenue. If you'll remember the way IGT works, there's a gross revenue amount that we receive, but in order to get that, we transfer money out. So we'll see it impacting both the revenue and the expenditure side. Obviously, there will be many other areas where there are going to be some differences between, our actual revenues and expenses in our budget, but that's one that we're now aware of, that's reflected in next year's budget, but we weren't aware of and wasn't reflected at the time we adopted mid-year budget.
Thank you.
So turning to take a look at our expenses, this chart shows salaries and benefits expenses. Again, the red line giving us the actual expenses so far through April of about $125.6 million. And that blue line is showing the budget, where we're expecting to end the year at about $152 million. You can see that we're tracking very closely with our budgeted number for salaries and benefits. And then just turning to look at total expenditures, which obviously include that salaries and benefits number. Our actual expenses so far about $151.6 million compared to a total budget for the year of $186.4 million. As I mentioned on the revenue side, we have some impact from that IGT that we know that we're not going to be expending that money. That's reflected here. But we'll also, I think, we'll see when we get to the report through the end of June, the impact of catching up a bit on the expenditure side relative to the revenue side. Essentially, with the way that our revenues work, getting them in those 2 installments and property taxes through the year, for the remaining 2 months of the year, we'll spend more than we'll be getting in. So I think you'll see that evening out. Finally, this chart shows the balance in our SERPT fund. That's our OPEB trust fund. And what you're seeing here on this chart are total amounts. So the current balance as of the end of April of 2016 was just under $19 million. That was made up of contributions from the inception of the fund until the end of April of just over $18 million, and then earnings over that same period of time, net earnings of just under $900,000. And then just in summary, for this 10-month period ending April 30th, we did receive, or we did recognize as revenues the second installment of property taxes because those were earned as of the end of April, but they were not reflected in our cash balance as of the end of April, so you'll see those in the cash balance in our next report. As I've mentioned, revenues and expenses are both trending slightly under budget, with revenues really outpacing expenditures through the first 10 months of the year through April. And we can see that we've actually received 92% of our revenue budget through the end of April, but have only spent 81% of our expense budget. And that's where, that we'll see that catch up a bit for the months of May and June, as our expenses for those months will likely outpace our revenues. And then finally, our SERPed earnings have returned to positive territory. You may remember in previous reports, just based on general market performance, that we were looking at some negative investment returns, but we now have nearly $900,000 in net earnings since the inception of the fund. And that concludes my presentation, but I would be happy to answer any questions you have.
I was wondering how all right, so as we're 9 months into our budget, approximately, or 10 months,
10 months,
excuse me, 10 months. I'm trying to think of the 2 months we've got left, 2 months into the budget, what did our labor costs look like? But then I realized that those are a bit skewed because we were in a protracted issue with labor, paying the additional monies for the health and the
The PERS, the employer's cost of
right.
PERS.
So I guess it's kind of hard to look at that and say, okay, we could take a snapshot there and put it on the other end. But, yeah, no, I've got every idea that it's probably gonna flush out pretty close to what it's supposed to be. But I guess I just had the bad memory of us having to spend so much money at the beginning of the year.
And
But I
we
had
did.
to talk about it, and now that I have, I feel much better.
Well, just, to provide some further context to these numbers, that mid-year budget number there of $152.3 million, that was a number that we adopted at mid-year, aware of the fact that cost sharing at that point had gone away. So, I think we're confident that we're within the ballpark of this budget number for ending the year.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions?
I don't have any.
Thank you.
All right then, well, thank you for that. Any other questions from directors or staff?
Not here?
All right then, at this moment, we will announce our next meeting date of August 25th at 5 p.m. We have no anticipated action or presentation items, and at this time, we will adjourn the meeting for the Finance and Audit Committee for today's date. All
Thank you,
right,
sir.
you're welcome, thank you.